Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you at Massey College, which is located on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge their stewardship of the land and the great privilege that we have here to continue our work. And today we're going to talk about democracy, about the threat to democracy in the digital world. And we could not have better guests than the group that you'll hear from today, led by Jeff Dworkin, who's a journalist extraordinaire. He's a senior fellow at Massey College and is the author of a recent book called Trusting the News in the Digital Age. So I leave it up to you, Jeff. Lead us.
Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. Welcome to everybody. Greetings from Toronto. We are really delighted to have this discussion, which seems to be engaging a lot of people everywhere, and especially here at the University of Toronto. We want to talk a little bit about the impact of social media on our democracies and what democracies need to do to protect themselves, certainly in their electoral processes, from the influx of fake news and disinformation, given the fact that social media is now everywhere, and our students and our fellow citizens and our colleagues are flooded by it now. And certainly in my experience teaching about journalism and digital media, our young students, 18, 19 years old, are frankly kind of overwhelmed by the tsunami of stuff that they encounter right from the beginning. We've seen how Russian bloggers and vloggers have interfered in the 2016 election, how they've attempted in the United States, and how they've attempted to do that in the most recent election, and how this influx of fake news and misinformation, deliberate misinformation, has had a destabilizing impact, certainly, on much of our democratic lives. And nations around the world are really wrestling with this impact, with a host of various challenges, including polarization and raised anxiety levels, more extremism, more violence, as seen on the internet, radicalization and fragmentation, the idea that, who can you trust? What can we do to restore that trust? And how can we handle these ideas for the health of our democracy and our civic lives? So it's a lot to unpack in the next little while, and we have with us two terrific experts who have discussed this. I want you to meet Professor Yasmin Dawood and Gabrielle Lim, who can talk quite eloquently about the threats posed by social media to this issue of disinformation. Let me start by giving you a little background to Professor Dawood. She's the Canada Research Chair in Democracy, Constitutionalism, and Electoral Law. She's an Associate Professor of Law and Political Science here at the U of T. Welcome. She was named a member of the Royal Society of Canada College in 2018, and her specialty is election law and comparative constitutional law, democratic theory. Her scholarship is concerned with improving electoral fairness and democratic governance. And she's testified before parliamentary committees and has been interviewed various places on issues around election law. She teaches constitutional law, the law of democracy, and legal methods at the Faculty of Law. And she was awarded the Mewett Award for teaching excellence just last year. Welcome, Professor Dawood.
Thank you.
Gabrielle Lim is a researcher at the Technology and Social Change Project at Harvard's Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. That's a very impressive place. And she's an associate with the Citizen Lab at the Monk School here at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses primarily on censorship and media manipulation, and the impact on civil society and freedom of expression and security. And she writes a lot about this on her website, gabriellelim.com. If I may start with you, Professor Dawood, Yasmin, what are the kinds of issues that are of your specific concern and that our students and younger consumers of media ought to be aware of? Please.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that very warm welcome. And also thank you to Principal Desrosiers for the invitation to come today to the Massey Dialogue. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with Gabby Lim and our audience today. So speaking a little bit more generally at first, I think there's no question that freedom of speech is the lifeblood of democracy. And our constitutional law reflects this, right? So the Charter protects the freedom of expression from governmental interference, subject, of course, to Section 1 of the Charter, which allows for reasonable limits on rights. So, for example, the Supreme Court has upheld a narrow prohibition on hate speech. Now, in terms of disinformation, this is a worry, but I think we should keep in mind it's by no means a new problem. Traditionally, we have thought about the problem of disinformation by using this analogy of a marketplace of ideas. And the idea here is that you need open competition between ideas, an open marketplace, in order for the truth to emerge. So this means crucially that the government should not be banning disinformation. Instead, the best way to protect the truth and protect democracy is to have a robust protection of free speech, right? Because you want citizens to be able to criticize the government. You want citizens to be able to challenge those in power without fear of penalty. So there's no question that freedom of speech is essential for democracy. And here's where the but comes in. There's a however. With respect to elections specifically, there are a couple of recent developments which Jeffrey alluded to in his introductory remarks, which have really started to cause worry, I think, in the election law field. The first recognition is that disinformation in social media obviously has lots of impacts and all over the place, but it also matters when it comes to elections, right? So Russian interference in the 2016 US election provides a very vivid illustration of this, but in other ways as well. We know that elections, the topics that are discussed, the positions that are taken are often influenced by what's going on in social media. So that's the first development. The second development is the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism around the world. Now, here's what's different this time. The difference is that authoritarian governments are not being brought about by tanks in the street like they might have been 30 years ago. Instead, we have elections as the way in which these authoritarian governments are taking root in former democracy. So this global context makes the dilemma with social media and elections feel much more acute. One thing I just wanted to say briefly is that just because disinformation has a negative impact on elections, this does not mean that the government should do something about it. And I think this is an important idea. That's because the negative effects of regulating the disinformation might outweigh whatever benefits would result from that regulation. So I just want to clarify that, concerns around disinformation, certainly within my field of election law, we're not talking about government bans on fake news. Instead, there are some more narrow questions that the field is wrestling with. So I'm just going to give you a couple of concrete examples before turning it back to you, Jeffrey. So let's say, for example, that someone sets up a website, a fake website. It looks identical to Election Canada's website. And this fake website posts false information about voting. So it tells people where to go, but it's wrong. It gives false information about the kinds of identification that they should bring, the date of the election, and so on. So here's a question. Should the impersonation of Elections Canada and all this false information about voting mechanics, Should this be prohibited? Yes or no? Here's another example. In Canada, we have strict rules around political donations and political spending on election advertising. And these rules are meant to level the playing field so that the wealthy don't have a disproportionate influence on elections. And we treat donations and money as a form of speech. So that's why it's relevant to free speech. So let's say you have a domestic NGO that has foreign donors. Should this NGO be allowed to use that foreign funding to pay for campaign advertising for a federal election in Canada? That's a question. That's where another free speech kind of question comes up. Here's a final example. When you see a political ad, let's say you're on Facebook or you're on TV and an ad pops up, a political ad, you'll notice that there's often a tagline, right, that discloses the person or the group that's responsible for that ad. Should that tagline be mandated by the government? Because it is, after all, a form of controlling speech. So that's another kind of question. Disclosure issues are another thing that we wonder about in the election law field. But more broadly, here is the dilemma when it comes to elections. How do we deal with the negative effects of disinformation on elections without interfering with the freedom of expression that is so crucial for democracy, right? So there's this trade-off. We need freedom of expression. It's the lifeblood of democracy. But what do we do with the negative effects of things like disinformation on elections?
Thank you, Professor Dawood. Yasmin, that was very interesting. And it's one of the things that, if anyone's outside of Canada listening to this, we're wrestling with Bill C-10, which is an attempt to figure out whether online content can or should be regulated, and if so, by whom. So, I mean, these are very important issues. I'd like to turn now to Gabrielle Lim, who has a tremendous background in all of these issues around technology and social change. Gabby, what are your concerns these days with regard to this issue?
Oh man, so many concerns.
In a brief way.
No, okay. So I think Yasmin got onto the point that I was thinking about too, is clearly disinformation, misinformation, they're issues that we need to grapple with. Every country right now is grappling with those issues. But the question of whether the government should do something, and specifically whether or not they should be banning certain types of content, is a really tough question. And what I like to think about is, in all of this, there is the notion of this hurts our security. This is a threat to our security, whether it's a threat to democracy, a threat to national security, or a threat to public safety and our well-being. But all of this comes down to, what are the ethics behind using security language when talking about freedom of expression and free speech? And so to me, this is one of my biggest concerns. I feel like it's very easy for us, especially in Canada and the United States, where I'm based right now, to talk about, disinformation is a threat to national security, disinformation is a threat to our public safety, because we have pretty strong protections for freedom of expression. However, that same rhetoric, when transported to a different country, looks very, very different. And so one of my worries is how the increasing securitization of types of information. And so this isn't new either. If we go back even just a handful of years, when ISIS was the hot talking point, there was a lot of discussion about what should we do about ISIS propaganda on Twitter. And so that was a start. And then we start talking about hate speech more in depth. And then now we're moving on to misinformation, disinformation. And so this isn't necessarily new, the idea of framing speech as a national security threat. But what's happening right now is we're seeing a lot of different countries come up with legislation that not only bans what the government deems fake news or disinformation, which, as you can imagine, can get quite problematic, but we're also seeing policy diffusion between these countries. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, Malaysia in 2018, I believe, passed the anti-fake news law. That was quite problematic. You could go to jail for accidentally spreading false information, for example. What happened around that same time as well is then Singapore passed their own version of a fake news misinfo law that would compel platforms to take down certain content and label certain content. And now we're seeing, I believe it's Nigeria, I think, has then proposed similar legislation that people have basically said is almost a copy paste of Singapore's legislation that also criminalizes and bans false information, however you want to define that. So my biggest concern is, how does this in the end affect civil society? Because I think, like freedom of expression, which we know is crucial to a thriving democracy, so is an active civil society and a very active independent press as well. And what we're ending up with around the world, some worse than others, is you have journalists and activists and NGOs fighting essentially what I would call a two-front war. They're fighting censorship on one hand, simultaneously they're also fighting misinformation and disinformation on the other hand. And when we talk about the harms of what this looks like and the effects, there's a lot of friction that is created, right? And so not only do you have harassment campaigns and threats to these people's lives, but you have friction in their daily lives. So you can imagine a journalist who then has to spend all their time fact checking false claims, or you have an NGO that then has to, instead of delivering the services that they're meant to provide, they end up having to counter online hate speech against them or try to protect their workers from different threats. So all this to say is, yes, disinfo, misinfo, whatever you want to call it, media manipulation is certainly an issue that we should talk about and find ways to address. But how we do so, and in a way that, like, I think everyone on this panel would probably agree with, that protects freedom of expression is really the tension at stake here. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Gabby. That's very interesting. One of the things that I've been wrestling with is, can information be regulated and still maintain the quality of the so-called free marketplace of ideas? And maybe it can't now in a digital age, because the sophistication of the various players is up against the inability of mainstream media organizations to combat it. We're seeing now that, in my opinion, the digital culture has kind of hollowed out the ability of mainstream media organizations to be appropriately contextual, to handle these floating viruses of mis and disinformation. And I think one of the issues that I've been talking to my students about is, does the public have an obligation to be sort of their own ombuds on these issues? Because there is so much now that is out there, and it's easy to share it and spread it around. Is the public able to combat these tendencies of mis and disinformation? And I think one of the things that I think that has been mentioned by Yasmin is this idea of how our media cultures have been destabilized in the digital environment, and what can be done to do that, to deal with that, especially when you have, bloggers in Macedonia or wherever sending out really unbelievable posts that have, in the 2016 election in the United States, basically equated the Democratic Party with the devil. And they targeted people who they found on the internet who have a strong religious sensibility. And a study somewhere, I believe at Harvard, has shown that 10% of the people who received these frankly crazy messages actually believed them, or at least said, well, what if they're even partly true? And that was enough in certain areas of the United States in 2016 to shift the election away from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. Does government, Yasmin, I'm going to ask you this, does government have any particular obligation to deal with this without impinging on people's right to consume crazy news?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, Jeffrey. It's a really hard question, because I think it gets to the tension that I think both Gabby and I agree is the main problem, which is to say you want to have the good, which is, you know, open discussion and free speech and all the rest, without the negative side. And so I think that one way to think about it is to think that you want to have a robust protection of freedom. And this goes to, I think, Gabby's concerns about countries that don't actually have that robust framework to begin with, right? But where you do have that robust framework, where freedom of speech is basically protected, my sense is that it's possible to get at things at the margins, right? So one way to do it would be to have more modest measures that would address certain things. For example, false information about the mechanics of voting, or impersonating Elections Canada, for example, right? So that you don't have the kind of disinformation that sends people to the wrong polling place. That being said, I'm not sure that you can really tackle false news, and there's lots of, or fake news. There are lots of dangers if you start going after people for saying something that's false. Let's say it's about a policy issue, or about a candidate, or about a political party. Where do you draw the line? And in addition to that, there's tremendous disagreement about what the truth is, or what a fact is, right? All the discussion about alternate facts notwithstanding, we don't any longer have an agreed upon set of facts that everyone adheres to. So I think that, in answer to your question, Jeffrey, I think that it has to be very careful, very modest, and very cautious. And I think Canada has made some moves in this direction, certainly with respect to elections. I'm not speaking about Bill C-10, to your point earlier. I think that's a different kettle of fish. But certainly with respect to elections, there have been some modest measures which I think are respectful of that tension.
Thank you. That's absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I wonder, Gabby, what your thoughts are about, is there a role for handling hate speech beyond the simple legislation that says that if a group is identified in the media as coming under criticism or being held in disdain, they can be charged with hate speech. But then it's like that old chestnut of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. One person's hate speech is another person's free speech. And I think that when I was talking to students, many of my students who are international students, who have quite a different concept of what constitutes acceptable content, and how do we help not only young students or international students, but help the public understand that there's a real dilemma here between giving people the right to voice their opinions, as objectionable as they may be, and their ability to want to talk about it. And let me just give you one more quick anecdote which popped up today, which is YouTube took down a video that was posted by the Israeli government, which basically told lies about what's going on with the Israeli army in Gaza. And I think it was the first in my experience to see that sort of thing happening. But there's more and more, in a time of this kind of turmoil, we're going to get more and more awful information being spread out there. What kind of balance, is the marketplace enough to handle this?
Oh man, solutions are hard to come by, aren't they? I think a couple things. So while you might have the right to free speech or the right to express yourself, you don't necessarily have the right to amplification. You don't have the right to have your voice shared across the internet. So there's been some interesting tests that I think the platforms have done where, for example, they might allow you to have your content up there, but they might hold back on certain features, so you can't share certain content. So I think there's some interesting ways to get around this into looking at the actual infrastructure of the platforms and seeing what are the features that allow for amplification, which is what we should be more concerned about versus just banning all false information or hate speech, because that can, like you said, that can get quite tricky, especially when it starts taking down legitimate content that we want up. And I also think while we do spend a lot of time talking about the platforms and technology at large, I think we also really need to talk about the role that other actors in this problem play. So mainstream media, for example, I think they've gotten a lot better since 2016, but there would be a time where they would basically repeat the false claims that were floating on the internet as if it was newsworthy. And at some point you have to ask yourself, why are they reporting on this? It was just a bunch of fringe accounts on the internet talking about X, Y, and Z, and now they're making it a news event. So I think there's also a role for mainstream media journalists to play in what they amplify, what they decide to debunk, and what do they decide to just say, maybe we'll keep monitoring this, but not yet. And also politicians. Something we always notice is when misinformation becomes truly dangerous, it's when it gets politically adopted by politicians who have a far greater platform and ability to amplify their messages across multiple different outlets over radio, broadcast, TV, as well as the internet. And so I think looking at how do these other actors and stakeholders play in this entire media ecosystem is really important. And then one last thing that came up just now when you mentioned, what are some of the things we can do with this? I always go back to the idea of amplification versus free speech. So with big events, say elections, or if there's an active crisis like the pandemic, we want to make sure that the right and correct information gets into as many people's screens as possible, right? So we want to amplify this correct information. And so I think content moderation and fact checking tends to be reactive, and it happens after the fact, and often it doesn't reach people who had seen the initial false information in the first place. So I think we need to start thinking about proactive ways. So how do we think about curation? So for example, the trending algorithm or the news tab on the platforms, who's curating what's going up there? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think there has been some improvement over the past few years. I think when the 2020 election happened, the platforms were smart in basically labeling across their websites, almost everywhere, like, this is the correct information. Here's where you go for the correct information. If you're voting, this is where you go. And so they keep repeating that information again and again and again. Similarly with the coronavirus, I think YouTube, Twitter, Pinterest, for the most part, if anyone searched for something COVID related, they would always have a tab that would go to the local health authority's website. So I think we need to think about more proactive ways and not just reactive ways, like taking down content afterwards.
Well, that's excellent. And I'm glad you mentioned the ubiquitous and occasionally dangerous idea of algorithms, because what we're seeing now is in our daily lives, if we Google, maybe I want to buy a watch, suddenly I'm flooded with ads for watches and etc. It's just become so imperative that we figure out a way in which there can be some kind of accountability for those kinds of things. The man that murdered the Muslims in the mosques in New Zealand a few years ago, he had a live camera on his hat, and he was streaming his awful events that he was doing. That got picked up by the algorithms, sort of this inanimate force out there that then started to refeed it to people who had shown those tendencies in the beginning. There needs to be, it seems to me, some way of handling that inhuman. I mean inhuman in the sense that no human being is involved in this process. But there needs to be some kind of method whereby whose algorithm gets seen and how is it manifested. This seems to be a huge thing, and maybe this is another subject for another dialogue, but maybe this is where artificial intelligence might be brought into handling this enormous mass of information that is automatically retransmitted without any kind of moderation involved. So, I mean, these are some of the things. And also the issue of out-of-country players. Certainly, there are people apparently based in Russia who have been involved in destabilizing simply for the purpose of having people question the validity of our systems and our electoral events. And it's interesting that this is not new for Russia. Back in 1924, there was something called the Xenov Letter, which you may or may not have heard of. Xenov was an early disinformation person out of Russia, and he sent a note to the London newspapers saying that there was going to be a Bolshevik revolution inside the British Army. And this was published in the tabloid papers of the time, created mass hysteria and destabilized the ability of the standing army, which had not been demobilized after World War I. It created chaos in that part of the British economy, the government, and the military for years. So, I mean, it's shown to be, as far as the Russians seem to be concerned, a very effective means of undermining what we think is important in our culture. So, I mean, it's just what's old is new again, unfortunately. Yasmina, is there any other areas that you've identified, right, not in 1924, but in 2021, that we need to be concerned about? Have you spotted any of these tendencies now?
So I think that just to pick up on things that both of you have said, just a couple of thoughts. First of all, social media has dramatically changed the existing political infrastructure. So think about President Trump. He could reach everybody through Twitter. And what this did, in effect, was it undermined the old party system. So political parties previously used to act as a medium between the government and the people. And the political party would be able to sort out ideas and come to a consensus and, frame things in a way that would be big tent ideas. And all of that changed with something like Twitter because President Trump did not need the party anymore to reach the people. He could reach them directly. So I don't even think we've caught up with the massive changes to our political infrastructure that have occurred because of social media. And of course, this has all kinds of impacts on elections as well. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that the goalposts are moving all the time. And this is a real challenge, right? So we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. Like right now, we're concerned about things like targeted advertising. So when you open Facebook, you see a completely different thing than what I see and that what Gabby sees. Everyone has a different feed, and it's all targeted to you specifically. So that is a tremendous concern, and of course, it has an impact on people's political opinions. They get more polarization because you tend to be exposed to more radical versions of what you already believed in because of the way the algorithm is sending things to you. So there's that problem. We're worried about deep fakes, right? Fake videos that seem so realistic, fake videos usually of well-known politicians or celebrities, which are very hard to discern from, very difficult to make out that they're fake. So what's going to happen to our elections in the future when you have these videos being circulated and there's genuine doubt about their validity or not? How do we believe anything? So those are our current concerns, but we don't know in 5 years what's going to happen. So I think the fact that the goalposts are constantly moving, the fact that there is that social media is becoming increasingly sophisticated makes the regulation piece even more challenging, right? So we don't just have the problem of the tension between protecting freedom of speech while trying to douse out the worst of it, we also have the problem that we don't know what the problem is going to be in 5 years. So back to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Yasmin. Before we open it up for questions from the people who are watching us, I hope there's a few of them. Gabby, can you talk a little bit about Citizen Lab and its role in trying to hold the internet to be a more accountable place? Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, I think, does an amazing job in identifying where this disinformation is coming from, who these masters of disinformation are targeting, and also how Ron Diebert, the fellow who's running the Citizen Lab, has done some really amazing things that are frankly terrifying, because he has now become the person who has revealed how groups like Black Cube have taken on the role of undermining people's reputations in this digital age. What is there your role? Can you talk a little bit about how Citizen Lab operates?
Oh man, that is a tough question. So I can only speak from my research there. But I think the approach we take, which is also similar to the approach we take at Shorenstein with my team here, we do a lot of investigation into different media manipulation campaigns. I think the approach we tend to take is socio-technical, and I keep saying this over and over again. I was on another talk earlier today where I also talked about socio-technical, but the idea simply being that yes, technology matters, and yes, it needs to be documented, all the different technical ways that it can, shift either the balance of power or, allow civil society to do X, Y, and Z, or be targeted by certain authoritarian regimes or corporations. But aside from the technical analysis, I think it's really important that we talk about the socio-political side as well, because these threats we're facing aren't just technological problems. They're political problems. They're socio-cultural problems. And I think putting that all together and having a holistic view of these issues is really important. And I think it's something that the lab has done quite well, and something we carry on at Shorenstein Center as well. And so when I think about solutions and how we need to deal with these threats, I often think, well, okay, what about the social side? What is it about our society right now that drives people to maybe seek out misinformation or misleading information? Is it low trust? Is it that we distrust our politicians? What's happened to journalism and the institutions that we once trusted? And why is this the case? So I think about, for example, my research on Malaysia, where we looked at the anti-fake news law for one, but one thing we noticed in studying that is people were shifting their news consumption primarily towards social media and WhatsApp. And one of the reasons when I spoke with people, civil society mainly, and journalists in Malaysia, why was that the case? One of the reasons was they simply didn't trust mainstream media anymore, because they felt that over the course of decades, they'd been lied to over and over again, partly because these media outlets have become subservient to the political powers that be, and essentially became party propaganda. And so when that happens, you have a shift in news consumption. So I think, to cut it short, basically, Citizen Lab does as well, but I think Shorenstein as well, really looking at the entire ecosystem and the socio-political drivers behind this, behind disinformation, as well as the reasons why we consume it.
I agree absolutely. And one of the things that I've sensed through my own teaching and research is that maybe the digital culture and democracy are really kind of incompatible at this point, because if any person's point of view, no matter how odd it may be, somehow gets communicated out there, the impact of that is that it calls into question the validity of major institutions, whether it's the media or the churches or the universities or governments, certainly. And this we're now at a point where we're trying to figure out, I think, a way of reimagining and reassembling the institutions that we need in a digital age. And that's going to be quite a challenge, I think, for all of us. I think I'd like to open it up to questions now. What's the best way of doing this at this point? Nathalie has said, more information is always better, more transparency, more tech-savvy electors will want more transparency and more information. Are you encouraged by the engaged population who consume more social media? Gabby, do you want to take that one?
Oh man, encouraged. I don't know if I'm encouraged. Then again, I feel like I woke up on the wrong side of the bed today, so I've been pretty pessimistic. I think, I don't know, I don't want to say one way or another, because like Yasmin mentioned earlier, the goalposts keep moving and we just don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. We talk about social media like Twitter and Facebook as if they've been around forever and that they're these big institutions, but not really. So it's been, what, a decade and a half? Things could change. We'll have new platforms. There's TikTok, So I don't know if I'm encouraged. I think some stuff that has been encouraging, whether or not this will actually be good in the long run, is I do think people are a lot more aware. And you see people fact checking one another online quite often. So if anything gains traction on Twitter, for example, or Reddit especially, users will jump on each other and try to say, oh, actually this is false and here's evidence, and then they'll link to a credible news outlet or something like that. So maybe, I don't know. To be honest, it really depends on the day I wake up, whether I'm encouraged or not.
Yasmin, what do you think?
Yeah, that's another tough question. I mean, I think to be just a tiny bit more optimistic, or maybe just to take a slightly different take on the question, democratic engagement is a great thing, right? So it's great that people are engaged democratically. I think what worries me more than democratic engagement is democratic apathy. I think once you have apathy, once you have discontent, once you have people not believing anymore in democracy, you end up, that's the first step on the road to authoritarianism, right? So when they do surveys of countries where authoritarian governments have taken over formerly democratic ones, one thing that has come up is that people no longer believed in democracy. So it's not exactly surprising. So I think that it's good to have democratic engagement. But I agree with Gabby that, it has to be a certain kind of engagement, right? It's got to be engagement which is skeptical, which is, thoughtful, which is not believing everything that's read. And I think some of the approaches, for example, that Canada has taken is to invest some funds in civic education and media literacy efforts. And I think that's an important thing, that part of civil society, part of having an educated citizenry is to have those tools. We need to be taught. And maybe it's something that should be taught in schools. And we have had some pilot programs around the world where school-age children are in fact taught how to engage with social media in a way that is more discerning and more skeptical and not believing everything. So I think that we might need to maybe some of the solutions are in fact to think a little bit more outside the box and think about things like media literacy, civic education, in order to really not get undermined by some of the downside of social media.
Well, that's an excellent point. And in the area of shameless self-promotion, that's why I wrote the book, which is written as a textbook, because when I would come into a first-year class and of journalism students, and very diverse, and quite a few international students, and I would ask them as a first question, what do you consider to be reliable information? And the response was fantastic. So I would get a young person whose family came, or he came from India, and he'd say, well, it's not Pakistani because they lie all the time. And a young woman from Pakistan said, wait a minute, it's the Indians who lie. So then we would get into a discussion about how do you determine what constitutes reliable information, hence the book. And I think that this is one of the challenges, it may be the challenge, which is to raise our critical thinking skills certainly among young people, and have them understand what the purpose of certain kinds of media are. What are their sources? Who's paying for it? Where does it come from? All of the questions that do a kind of a deep dive into what constitutes reliable information. Is there another question? From Akash Maharaj, is social media distorting society or revealing it? Excellent question. Is it fomenting anger and an appetite for misinformation, or is it revealing that we have always felt this way, but did not have a way to broadcast it? I think it's doing both, if I may jump in at first. I think it is both a mirror that is an accurate reflection of society, but it is also a distorting mirror as well. Because in an age where people go to certain media that confirms their bias, it's what the sociologists call bias confirmation. So that people in this welter of media tsunamis that envelops us, people are kind of going back to what they believe is supporting of their own values. There is the Pew Research Center just about a month ago did a study that showed that people are now disconnecting from the news because it's been so relentlessly harsh, bad in some instances, and they're retreating to cat videos and pornography. And I think that this becomes only 21% of the people surveyed in the Pew research, 21% feel that they can still trust the news. That's the lowest it's ever been. So I think we're at a really difficult time. Gabby, do you have any response for that last questioner?
I think similar to you, it's both, and it really depends case to case. I think in some ways it does skew our perceptions of society. One, because social media can help mainstream some pretty fringe ideas, right? And so those ideas that would have otherwise been set aside to small corners of the internet are suddenly being shared in like my dad's Facebook feed and in our WhatsApp groups. And so in some cases, yes. I also think back to the whole media ecosystem in general. It's self-referential, right? So mainstream media often reports on what's trending on Twitter. Twitter then will report on what's happening on the New York Times homepage, and so it creates a strange feedback loop. And I think that also can skew what we think is important or what we think is a proxy for public opinion, which I think can be dangerous. So you often find that reporters will say such and such hashtag was trending as if it was public opinion, but we don't really know why. Was that gamed? Was it because of something in the algorithm that we don't know about? Or was that being bought and paid for by some party with a lot of resources? So I think to some extent it does skew society or our perception of society, but it's also revealing in certain ways. But so on the last note, I think we often worry that social media creates, division, it sows discord and distrust, but also to note that that's not a bad thing. Like within a democracy, you want agitators. Civil society is an agitating force. They seek to sow discord, to raise issues that need to have attention paid to. So I think thinking about it in that sense is also important. It's not all, discord is not always a bad thing.
So we want more shit disturbers, basically.
You said it, not me.
Yasmin, any thoughts on this?
I agree with both of you. I think it is both. I think it definitely reflects, and to the question asked, does it give people permission? I agree with that. I think that once they see it, people feel more comfortable to express a similar view. But I also think it does polarize. Like, you know, they've done experiments which show that when you are talking to someone who agrees with you, you actually become more convinced of your opinion, and in fact more radical the more you're exposed to people who agree with you. And that's really what social media does. It just feeds you people who agree with you. So it ends up polarizing people so that they agree, they end up becoming further apart from one another. And I think this does actually cause, over the long run, really significant challenges for democracy and for elections, because you no longer then have common ground, right? There's no common ground as to facts. Think about climate change or anything, right? Everyone has a different set of facts, or COVID, vaccine, you know, the efficiency of vaccines and so on. So there are no common facts. There's no agreement about solutions. And so I think that the polarization and the divide, yes, we do want agitation in civil society, but not to the point where we cease to have things in common. So again, there's that tension. In all of these things, there's some balance between these different aspects of democracy. And I'm not sure that we've figured out exactly how to do it when it comes to social media.
And for me, the problem is also the fact that so many mainstream media organizations, except for a few really good ones, which have deeper pockets than the others, have resorted to just providing what I call the low-hanging fruit of information, which is at the local level, weather, traffic, and crime, all three of which originate from government sources. The idea of contextualizing and doing more investigative reporting is left to fewer and fewer mainstream media organizations and the occasional outside group, especially in the United States, Politico and some of the others, which do a great job. And that becomes part of this media ecosystem, that mainstream media isn't doing what it once did, and it's now relying on outsiders and on advocacy groups in many instances to fill out the news hole. Any other questions out there? Because we're kind of running out of time at this point. Okay, well, I think we've kind of exhausted our audience's ability or willingness to question. So I've got a couple more that I wouldn't mind throwing out just to round out the hour, which is, how do you see the role of government, of national governments in resolving this issue around information in a democratic and digital culture? Gabby, what do you think? Is there a role for government, or are we now prisoners of the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution?
I definitely think there's a role for government. It's just to what extent does that look like, and what sort of role are they playing? So back to the idea of trust in institutions, trust in our media system. In that respect, I think the government has a huge role to play. If people don't trust them, they ought to figure out why and find a way to remedy it. So I think something that's very interesting is you look at a country like Taiwan, which is bombarded by misinformation and propaganda from China, as well as from within the island. And one of the things the government does is they try to be as transparent, open, and communicative as they can with their citizens. So if there are any allegations that are false, they will immediately, like, they have a goal. They actually have like a timeline. Like, the government needs to address this within X amount of hours, and we need to be as clear as to why and give as much information as possible. So I think that's really important. And when it comes to the question of, okay, well, why don't the people trust you? And it's like, they might have very legitimate reasons. Yes, they might be consuming some misleading information that, you know, confirms their beliefs about their government. But if there are legitimate reasons to distrust your government, of which we have many, those need to be addressed. So I do think there's a role for the government. We should demand more from them.
At least be clearer about what their plans are. As we're seeing in Canada with COVID, every level of government has a different approach to this issue. Yasmin, what do you think of the role of government in this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that when it comes to elections, I can't think of a more important thing government should be doing than to shoring up public trust in the fairness of elections, right? So that is the foundation of authority. That is what, allows us to think that this government, in fact, is a legitimate government, the fact that it was elected into office. Now, if the election itself is seen as being unfair or lacking in integrity, then the entire, foundation of government is sort of also on a very shaky ground. So I think the government, when it comes to elections, absolutely has a very important role to play in terms of ensuring that it's a free and fair election. I will say Elections Canada does, in my view, a fantastic job of this, of explaining, being transparent, providing information, and so on. But I think when it comes to the digital world, there are definite challenges. Like what are some of the things that Canada ought to do? So, for instance, Canada has adopted something called the Declaration on Election Integrity. It's also adopted something called the Digital Charter, which identifies 10 principles for regulating the digital sphere. So I think all these things are important because they establish certain norms. They establish certain values that we need for a democracy. And I agree with Gabby, it's not just about rules and institutions. There are norms and there are beliefs and ideals and values that matter a great deal. And I think the government has an important role to play there as well.
Thanks. That's exactly my point of view as well. I'm glad we didn't get into a big argument on this. Thanks to the internet, this newfangled thing called the internet, I just got an email from a colleague, James Cullingham, who asks, what do the panelists think of the power of social media organizations themselves to ban or promote points of view? This becomes part of the ability or the lack thereof of bloggers and people who have a strong point of view about a particular social issue. Should the government be regulating those? Should we give this power over to the CRTC or to Ofcom in the UK? Gabby, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I'm reluctant to say yes, but yeah, no. I mean, your colleague is correct in that these powers have so much. They have a lot of power, sure. I think, as you've seen, when Trump was removed from Twitter and Facebook, there was suddenly, it felt like there was a hole in our media ecosystem when he went quiet. And when these platforms choose to remove you, they can, in effect, silence you. So years ago, when, for example, Milo Yiannopoulos was a big name that was being floated around alt-right circles, and he was getting a lot of press coverage and mainstream press coverage as well. But when the platforms removed him, it was almost silence after that. So yes, they do have a lot of power in removing certain types of speech and people. Deplatforming does work. For good or for bad, if we're talking about hate speech, then it's a very good thing, right? But whether or not the government should step in and regulate that, I don't know. I'm gonna be a little cheap and kick it over to Yasmin to answer that one, because I'm reluctant to say yes or no.
We're almost out of time, so Yasmin, what do you think briefly?
I think it can be done very well or very poorly, and that is the problem, right? So having the government regulate, if it's doing it in a very careful, very minimalist way, maybe that would be okay. But if it's heavy-handed and, if content of ordinary users is being regulated, that just strikes me as a very bad idea.
Okay, all you First Amendment lovers out there, you have our point of view on this. I want to thank Massey and Yasmin and Gabby for a really terrific discussion, and especially to Nathalie, who organized all this, and to all the support staff at Massey for this. Thank you all very much. We really appreciate this discussion.